Welcome back to the Commercial Real Estate Show. I'm Michael Bull. Today our topic, oops, I should have covered that in the lease. My guest is Laura Hall. She's a partner with the law firm Sheley, Hall, Williams. And we talked about 2 or 3 things already. Now I'm going to talk about one more that I think is really important to me. And and we sell a lot of investment properties at my shop around the Southeast. And this is one of the things that when we start selling investment properties and we're dealing with the tenants and things, the options to renew, that the tenants have options to renew their lease, right, can be a lot of struggles for landlords and tenants. So what do you think about options to renew? What are your tips?
Well, virtually every lease you deal with has one. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing is they rarely get exercised. At least that's my experience. Mm-hmm. And so if you're drafting these, you want to make sure you've got very good time frames. If you're a landlord, you want a much longer period of time to require the tenant to exercise it. So that if they don't exercise it, then you can either go to the negotiation table with the tenant and start talking terms, or you can start marketing the space. If you're a tenant, you want to make sure that your time periods are a little bit shorter. However, if you're not staying, you obviously need time to find a new home and to negotiate that new deal and to move. But it's interesting. I rarely see them exercised. Yeah. The parties will come to the table even months before the notice period even runs, yeah, and start sitting down talking about them.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the important things to think about when you're involved as a landlord or a tenant in an option to renew. It's a unilateral right. It's the tenant's typically right. And typically they have a set rent amount, right, and so they have the right just to do that. So unless the market is a lot higher rent, which you might get in some markets at this point, but because rents have gone up a good bit, so we might see more renewal options. But one of the things that I like to tell tenants is get any and all renewal options you can. But then on the landlord side, it's like, I know you're going to have to give some renewal options to tenants, but when you can avoid it. Because absolutely, especially if they only have to give 6 or 12 months notice to renew, it can really put you in a bind.
It absolutely can. And so you do want to avoid it. And with any kind of sophisticated tenant that's represented, mm-hmm, they're going to have renewal options. It's rare that they don't. So if the oops for a lot of times with tenants is you want to make sure that there's a mechanism if you do exercise the option and you can't come to terms on the rate or the terms of the renewal, make sure that you have some kind of a mechanism to arbitrate or determine that rate. And we refer to it as commercial baseball arbitration or some other type of arbitration that you can go to come up with a fair determination. Again, in many years of practice, I have seen one arbitration actually go full blown. I'm sure it happens, but you do want that protection in your lease, because otherwise, the gotcha is if you can't come to terms, then more than likely your renewal option just expires.
Yeah, and you're talking about a renewal option the tenant has, but it's at a then market rate.
Right.
And as a broker, I hate those situations because it seems like I'm putting the parties in a situation that they have to agree.
Right. That's exactly right.
And I don't like putting clients in that position that they have to agree.
Right.
Let's say, all right, I prefer as a tenant rep especially that, hey, there's a set rate. And then if you're the tenant, you don't want to pay that rent, it's not market, then obviously you could talk about it because it's your right to renew. And I love your point on the time frame. I mean, if you're a landlord, boy, get as much advance notice as possible because your hands are so tied. And then as a tenant, you probably want the shortest you can get so you have more flexibility. But you can't wait until then because you don't have any time left. So let's say you got 6 months renewal option, you're a tenant. And you start, 7 months before the end of the lease, you start talking land. Well, you're going to be there. You have no time.
Right, exactly right. You've negotiated yourself into a no-win situation. So
right. So you're going to take that renewal option at that rate. If the landlord is negotiating on his own behalf, well, that's what you're going to end up doing, right?
That's exactly right. And it's interesting. We rarely see stated rental rates in renewal options in office. I know in retail that's pretty common, but in office leases, you rarely see that the rate's going to continue at a 3% escalation or that it's going to be starting at some rate, because as we've seen, the markets have gone all over the place depending on what's going on in the world.
Again, you're doing a lot of work on the landlord side.
I do.
On the tenant rep side, we're like, if you, in my mind as a tenant rep guy, if you don't have a set rate, you don't have much of an option. You can not be thrown out of the space,
right?
But who knows what market is, and when you're trying to run a business, it's hard to budget that whatever the market might be. In some of these markets, our office in Atlanta, and there hasn't been a lot of new construction. We've seen rent increases on office space like we've never seen before.
Absolutely.
Our rents are still really low for a major market around the U.S., but still there's some rate shock going on.
There is, and if you have that situation from a landlord's perspective where there are stated numbers in the lease, you really hope that tenant misses their renewal option. But we have seen a tremendous growth in rental rates, and certainly in a lot of markets. But having the prevailing market rate thing in there is actually a fairly market term these days to base it on whatever is in market, and that can be good for either party or bad for either party. So
I agree, it's market. When I'm a landlord rep, it's market.
That is exactly
that's what
right.
everyone's doing. Okay. Well, one of the things that let's ask you this. So, what are some of the new things in office leases that you're seeing come up? You mentioned something earlier that we deal with a lot in retail leases, but we don't seem to see it as much in office leases, and that's kind of real determination or right of use and exclusives, right?
Right. One thing I've seen several of lately is where some of your bigger tenants, and we're talking 10% of your building or somewhere in that number, are being successful in adding an operating covenant so that the landlord is not able to lease space to a competitor. And in office buildings, that's a little bit unusual. You don't see that near as much because to me, it's sort of a natural exclusion. If you're a brokerage company or a law firm and there's another big law firm in your building already or another big brokerage group, you're more than likely not going to want to go to that building, particularly if that building has become known as the XYZ company's building. Right. So I don't really see I don't see that it gives a lot of benefit to the tenant to give those types of exclusions. What it does is it presents, again, as sort of another gotcha for a landlord if they forget about it, because it is an unusual provision and they do lease space to another law firm that could be deemed a competitor. Certainly not all law firms compete with one another or brokerage groups, but it's been something that I've seen more in the last year to two than I've seen probably in a while. Well, it's very common in retail, but certainly not in office.
Well, it's interesting because agglomeration, sometimes there's benefits for similar companies in the same industry to be close to each other.
True.
For attracting talent, retaining talent. So it's interesting to see that. And we're the largest tenant in our building, and we're on the top floor.
Right.
And I actually thought about that when we went in our building, and we have signage on the front of the building or on the monument signs. Right. And I thought about that. Do I want that? I'm like, you know what? No, I would like lots of brokerage companies in this building.
Yeah.
That would be fine with me. We love our competitors, and we love to compete. And I think it would be great for my building to be known. But it's interesting that you're seeing that in an office environment more.
I am, and it's you have to be very careful how you draft it, because you obviously want to make sure the oops you want to avoid is if that tenant assigns the lease to, a law firm assigns their lease to a brokerage company or a financial services group, all of a sudden you still got this covenant in there that says you can't lease to a law firm. So you want to make sure from a drafting standpoint that you are having those types of restrictions go away based on some triggering event, either defaults or assignments or something else, just to give some protection.
So I guess then there's more importance in that situation than there used to be in an office lease about use of the space, right? What you can use the space as general office.
Right.
Might be too vague now.
Well, but yes, no, that is very, very common that's all it says.
Yeah.
So when you're leasing space and you're saying we want lease space to a competitor, again, you just have to make sure that you're covering yourself if those competitors are really no longer relevant.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and then if you're agreeing to that now, and in a previous lease, that wasn't restricted, and they can change their use, you might not be able to.
Exactly.
You might not be able to honor that agreement.
True, but in office buildings, that's pretty uncommon, probably.
Yeah.
So, because your brokerage groups.
All right, so let's talk about a tip. what would you leave our audience with a tip related to office leases?
Probably with respect to the things that I don't like to see in office leases, deal around with assignment and sublet. A lot of tenants want complete and unconditional abilities to assign their lease to somebody else. The one practice tip I've got for landlords is make sure that you've got some good financial covenants in there for your protection. You don't want those leases to simply be given to somebody else and you have no control over who's coming into your building. And it's not really from a use standpoint, because in office buildings you're typically going to have just a straight up office use. It's really how well are they going to be able to pay the rent. And from a tenant standpoint, they don't want to have any handcuffs. If we're still liable, then you should look to both of us. But obviously from a landlord's perspective, they're concerned about the creditworthiness of the outgoing tenant and the incoming tenant. So just be careful on drafting to be able to make sure you're covered from a financial standpoint. Tenants, again, want full and unconditional abilities to do what they want to with their business.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And speaking of that, we rep tenants, and sometimes we'll go in a building, and just the nature of the tenants in the building
Right.
turn off our tenant.
Absolutely.
So if they start subleasing to tenants that are walking around and mud on their shoes.
Right.
It's like,
or
this is financial building.
Exactly. Or you've got a tenant in there. It could be a governmental entity or some other type of tenant who has a lot of so it puts a strain on your parking. It puts a strain on your elevator and your services, because all of a sudden you've got all these people coming in and out of your building. So there are a lot of sort of natural deterrents to office leasing, and from your standpoint, that keep a lot of companies from not wanting to go into a building.
That's right.
So.
Well, Laura, thanks for joining us.
Glad to do it.
Great insight.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And thanks for joining us there on the radio stations around the country, or maybe you're on YouTube, iTunes, or the show website. Please comment, follow, share. We'd love to hear from you. And thanks for being with us. I'm Michael Bull. This is the Commercial Real Estate Show. Stay tuned. We'll have more on Oops, should have covered that in the lease. Hey there, thanks for checking out the Commercial Real Estate Show. Don't miss a video of special interest to you. Be sure to subscribe below. And if you appreciate the videos, be sure and thank our sponsors. There's a link to more information about them in the description. For more videos, podcasts, and articles, check out creshow.com.